I guess over the years between the 1990s and 1996 was really my first big interaction with the United Nations. I was a part of what was called the National Coordinating Committee for the repatriation of South African exiles. And so I was part of this sort of, what would one call it, body which was helping to bring exiles home. To participate both in the negotiations, but also finally to come home after many years of exile. And then intermittently over the years did various things for the UN, advising on truth commissions, going in to help countries set them up. One of the most important, I think, pieces of architecture is what we call special procedures. And special procedures involve what we call the appointment of rapporteurs, who are called special rapporteurs to the Human Rights Council, who advise the Council on particular specialized interests, sometimes involving violations. Now, the role of a special rapporteur is really not to deal only with individual incidents or cases, but really to look at what we call the systemic and the structural questions around why this is happening. The problem, of course, that one does have with the special rapporteurs is that you cannot go into a country uninvited. You have to write to the state and ask for permission to be allowed to visit that state. And of course, the state itself can call upon you. Now, what's interesting about the reports of these rapporteurs is that they usually highlight systemic abuses, and these reports go to the Council with recommendations. And what that then allows for is a discussion by your peers, other states saying what they think you should be doing around the recommendations. And generally it has worked quite well. Another mechanism, of course, is the question of the appointment of experts. And experts usually also have a very particular mandate, but they have less of a likelihood of crafting their mandates, to respond in a way that they do, there's a lot less leeway. And so if an expert is appointed, it will be with a very specific task, and it will usually be for a very short period of time, whereas special procedures, the rapporteurs usually serve for a period of X number of years. They can have that mandate renewed for a second time, and their reports go directly to the Council. Now, with an expert, it depends on how the expert is appointed. Is the expert reporting to the President of the Council? Is the expert reporting to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights? Will their reports go to the Council? These are all things which need to be discussed. So there are pros and cons, but usually the starting point for the Council is the appointment of an expert, and then from the report that emerges to look at having a special procedure mandate holder to actually then be appointed. I think experts have a lot of leeway because they too can decide that they want to visit a country to look at the situation, but they also have the prerogative to travel around the world and in fact to invite people to come out and meet with them. So for instance, if one thinks about having an expert on Sogi, there will be many countries in the region that object to that kind of expert. But what that expert can do is convene consultations with victims of abuse and violations in other countries that are willing to, in fact, allow that. So there are many creative ways in which you can use to actually get the same information. And I think that's where, it might be useful to have an expert start the process rather than just have a special rapporteur. That could be a second phase of the Sogi process. Sogi, I think, needs a particular expert because I think the world is grappling with how to deal with LGBTI rights. I think we've won the notion of equality and that it's about human dignity and the fact that all people are created equally. But what we cannot deny is that there are, in fact, many countries around the world and many, many religious groups who do not accept that to be different and to have a different sexual orientation and gender identity is not acceptable either in their culture or in their religious traditions. And that therefore in many countries you've had people's rights denied. I think we see this both in many, I mean, I'm not sure there's any country in the world that is immune from this, but it has taken on a particular form, particularly in our region. And so the appointment of an expert, I would say, is almost a natural graduation of having the resolution in 2011. Because I think what the resolution did was it opened the space for a discussion on LGBTI rights. But I think we have to go further, and we need to understand what are the structural impediments to having members of the LGBTI community enjoy their rights. Now, is this creating a hierarchy? I don't think so. If you look at the council's parameters, it has a special council on minority rights. It has one on people of indigenous belief. It has looked at very specific cases around the world. And I think in a time when the question of transgender and intersex rights are concerned, and those give, I think, particularly difficulties around legal reform and acceptance in societies, it's really important to have this kind of expert who can begin to unpack what are the key questions which face people of the LGBTI community enjoying their right to dignity. The appointment of an expert on Sogi, in my view, doesn't really affect what I would call the rights of these other particular groupings, because if you look at the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on violence against women, I think you will find that the question of sex workers, the question of reproductive rights, already find themselves in that particular mandate. And one only has to read, in fact, the reports of the different rapporteurs on violence to actually discover that. I do think there may be overlapping, and that may be a good thing, because what it will allow for is a synergy and a broader unpacking of the issues. But what we're talking about is a very different mandate. We're talking about a mandate that is focused on the question of sexuality and sexual orientation, but also the question of identity and the question of whether or not, what does it mean to say that one has a non-conforming gender identity? These are very new terms for, I think, communities around the world who are struggling to find expression and acceptance of identity. And it's my view that the appointment of an expert will begin to help unpack that. And really the key question should be, what does it take to live with human dignity? That's in our Constitution, and that's certainly embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's what we should be looking at, that people are human. And in that humanity, how do they begin to live with that acceptance of human dignity? I think the question is always one of intersectionality. And, one of the things we should remember is that often what affects one's position is also the question of race and class. And so I think it's possible to look at the question of how race has also affected the particular struggle of people in the LGBTI community, and also whether or not other rights have been compromised, the question of torture, the question of unlawful killings. So the question of the way in which the legal system has dealt with a particular community. And so it's very possible for an expert to speak to the other mandate holders and to talk about how does one link that question of intersectionality to what is, I think, a common cause. But I think the point is to look at a holistic, comprehensive way of beginning to address the question of violations. The South African government is obliged, I think, in terms of its own constitutional obligation around the question of equality, to take a position which favors a constitutional go. South African organizations have to see the struggle of LGBTI people for equality as a human right.